Hello, my name is Nikki Milner and I'm from the University of York and I will be chairing today, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this event and the York Festival of Ideas. And I am delighted to introduce to you Dr. Jim Leary. So Jim is a senior lecturer in the Department of Archaeology at the University of York, and his research focuses on later prehistoric landscapes, monuments, and mobility and movement in archaeology. And today he'll be talking to us about his latest book, Footmarks, A Journey into Our Restless Past, which I have here. Beautiful book. And through this talk, he's going to be taking us through the footsteps of early hunter-gatherers, through to trackways, which have been hollowed out by feet in the more recent past. He's going to be showing how people have always been moving, and talks about an era of the past that, strangely, in archaeology, we do tend to ignore. So it's absolutely fantastic that he's written this book and is here today to talk to us. Also in the audience this afternoon we have local artist Michelle Hughes, who illustrated Jim's book, and his beautiful prints. As I say, you can see some on the front cover, which is absolutely...
That's not Michelle's.
Oh, sorry. But you, okay, sorry, apologies. But you can see all these beautiful prints of footmarks through the book, illustrating these lovely chapters. And Michelle is selling her prints downstairs in the atrium after the talk. So thank you for being with us today as well, Michelle. So Jim, no further ado, over to you.
Thank you very much. And I'm absolutely delighted to be speaking to you at the York Festival of Ideas. As Nikki says, I'm going to be talking about my forthcoming book. It comes out on the 6th of July, although Fox Lane Books downstairs actually has 30 copies that are a full month ahead of publication that you can buy, and I'll pop down after this and happy to sign any copies if you would like me to. And so what I thought I would be doing is, since this is the Festival of Ideas, I would talk about the ideas behind the book. The book is about movement and mobility, and I talk about these issues that Nikki just mentioned, that we don't really discuss this in archaeology. It's kind of missed out. So I've kind of focused on that during this talk. The book also focuses on that, but then populates it with all sorts of moving stories from the past, which are not in this talk. I can't talk about everything. So if you want the full story, buy the book. What I want to do is start with this little chap, actually. This is a sea squirt. And these fascinating creatures live on the ocean floor, merrily moving around and feeding. That is, until they find the ideal rock located in water that is the perfect temperature and with plenty of food around. And then, having found their home beneath the sea, they fix themselves to it and eat their own brains. They do this because once they've taken up residence, they never move again. Literally, the only reason the sea squirt has a brain is to enable movement. Movement is the most extraordinary thing ever developed by living creatures. Judging by the little sea squirt, there is no other reason for having a brain, or probably muscles. More than building a house or a monument, knapping stone or making fire, moving is the most important thing we've ever done in the history of humankind. In truth, there probably would be no kind of humanity without it. Mobility makes us everything that we are, and everything that we ever have been. To move is to be alive. And mobility is deeply embedded within our thoughts. A line of thought is a path along which our thoughts travel. They proceed step by step, arriving at the next point, hoping to reach a conclusion. At times, our mind races along. At others, it gets stuck. Occasionally our mind wanders and goes off on flights of fancy. With a good argument, we can wrong foot someone and put them on the back foot, but best foot forward. And if you have one foot in the grave, you are likely to be on your last legs. Love is often expressed as a journey along a path too. Relationships can go far, couples gravitating towards one another with no turning back. Or they may reach a crossroads and eventually choose to go their separate ways because they've run out of steam. Some relationships go nowhere, of course, or find that the path is long and bumpy, while other relationships simply fly from the start. In many societies, time is also conceptualised as moving, with the future normally understood as in front of us, while the past is behind us. We face forward towards the future. We look forward to some things, Christmas perhaps. Time is coming or long since gone. It also flies if you're having fun, but we don't want it to pass us by. Movement pervades our entire conceptual system, leaving a long trail of metaphorical language, and it is used to grasp abstract concepts such as love and time. We experience the world through bodily motions, and we learn about the world and the things in it through movement. Walking as thinking has a long history, traced back to at least the peripatetics of ancient Greece. The Greek sage walking along a colonnade followed by his pupils may be a bit of a caricature, but it is suggested that Plato taught while walking, and Aristotle, known as walker, was known as the walker due to teaching on the hoof, as depicted in the imagination of Raphael here in this fresco, where he modestly painted himself in as Aristotle and Michelangelo as Plato. Numerous philosophers have invoked this Socratic tradition. Jean-Jacques Rousseau declared he could only think when walking in his books Reveries of a Solitary Walker. He describes his walks as flights of thought. Immanuel Kant undertook walks around Königsberg with such regularity that he was known as the Königsberg Clock. His route through the park was later known as the Philosopher's Walk. Friedrich Nietzsche actually believed that walking produced better ideas. Only ideas won by walking have any value, he asserted in Twilight of the Idols. And a similar walking philosophy can be traced through many of the Romantic period writers too. Henry David Thoreau, to take one example, was a heroic walker, and the author of the first philosophic treatise on it simply called Walking. And famously, William Wordsworth walked compulsively, composing his poems while his lyrical feet stepped out the metre. And Charles Dickens would also plot his novels on foot, often during long sleepless nights as he tramped the dark streets of London. And having a good understanding of past mobilities lies at the very heart of archaeology too. It allows us to discuss the movement of people, ideas, objects, and information from place to place, from one person to another. We can see movement by the artifacts we find, working out where they came from and comparing that to where they ended up. And mobility obviously figures highly in discussions of isotope and ancient DNA analysis. The Amesbury Archer is a premier example of this. In this Bronze Age burial, we can see that not only did many of his grave goods come from distant lands, travelling far and wide, but so did he. A study of the isotopes within the enamel of his teeth tells us that he grew up in continental Europe, in the regions around the Western Alps. And we can see mobility in the skeletal records. Regular movements change and shape our bodies. Far from being fixed structures, the skeleton is plastic and mouldable, imperfect and breakable, vulnerable to disease and decay, and mobility scores itself into the body. Different habitual actions over a person's lifetime put strain on the skeleton. As a result, new bone tissue is preferentially added to the shafts of the bone under strain, changing their shape so that it can withstand the load. People who regularly walk or run have thicker lower limb bones, while those who use their arms a lot will have more robust upper limbs. And we can see this in modern sports people. Studies have shown that swimmers and cricketers have pronounced bone growth in their arms, while cross-country runners and hockey players have the same in their legs. If someone uses one side of their body more than the other, this will lead to asymmetric bone growth. Tennis players have considerably thicker bones on their playing side than on their non-playing side. And it works both ways too, so that decreased activity leads to bone loss and more gracile bones. So for the archaeologist then, the body can provide insights into past repetitive movements. Another way of seeing movement in the archaeological record is through footprints. A great example of this are the footprints Martin Bell and colleagues have been excavating at Goldcliff in the Severn Estuary. These date to the Mesolithic period, around 7,000 years ago. Over 20 distinct trails have been recorded there, some of them leading to known and excavated Mesolithic hunter-gatherer campsites, while others converge on points that presumably once had been campsites, and others still apparently leading to fish traps. Many of the printmakers are children, some as young as 4, showing that even the young were venturing out into the muddy estuary and contributing to community life. And my favourite of these tracks is actually this one up on your screen, which shows a 4-year-old child, or a 3 or 4-year-old child dancing around with an older child, maybe 6, 7 or 8. And the older one walks in a kind of more sensible way, but the younger one jumps around and dances around this other one until eventually the young one's footsteps just disappear. And at that point, the older ones become just that little bit deeper into the mud. And so we have this little snippet, this little moment from the past, 7,000 years ago, where we can see, presumably the older one, slightly frustrated with their younger sibling, picks them up and walks off with them. From these tracks, we can record the length of the stride as well as the pace at which each person is walking. The faster they ran, the further apart we find their footprints. A slow and steady speed leaves regular footprints close together. And from the size of their feet, we can say a certain amount about their age and their body size. We can't say a huge amount about their sex because the overlap between men and women is actually too great to do that. We can see similar in older examples too. Best known comes from Laetoli on the southern margin of the Serengeti Plains in Africa. Here, the famous archaeologist Mary Leakey discovered preserved footprints dated to 3.66 million years ago of an early human species, likely to be Australopithecus afarense, walking tall on 2 extended legs without crouching or using knuckles as support. The tracks belong to 3 individuals of different body sizes, tall, a medium, and a small, possibly a family. The smaller one walked, limping, alongside the larger, while the middle-sized one walked behind, very carefully and delicately stepping within the footprints of the tallest. Extraordinary moment in time from just a mind-bogglingly long time ago, preserved for archaeologists to find in the record. So clearly, mobility has served archaeology well. And yet, on the whole, the actual act of movement and the role it plays in the production of social life, from an archaeological point of view, remains largely unexamined. It is rarely studied directly as a subject in and of itself, but more frequently as an aside. We can see this when we excavate a site. I'm always struck by how all the action and the noise above ground of any archaeological site, the movement of hand and machine-dug earth and endless flows of people, contrast with the static and silent understanding we impose on the lives we excavate below. And in this photograph here, you can see Nikki digging, and actually over here is my oldest daughter, Dora, in the audience, also doing a little bit of digging. It's a family affair, archaeology. I'm as guilty as everyone else on this. Some years ago, I excavated a magnificent Neolithic site inside Mardenhenge in the Vale of Pewsey in Wiltshire. We uncovered the well-preserved chalk floor of a 4,500-year-old building, a Neolithic building. A large hearth, that is, a fire, dominated the centre, and around the fire, scattered over the floor, were pieces of pottery and flint flakes, lying exactly where they had been originally dropped. Outside the building was a pile of pig bones, representing joints of meat roasted on the bone. And mixed in with this were pieces of grooved ware pottery. This pile was not a rubbish dump that had accumulated over time, but the result of a single action, the remnants of a feast. This scene was an astounding discovery, once in a lifetime. But what really struck me was how much it looked like the morning after the night before. The music stopped, debris strewn around, and all partygoers gone. In the Neolithic, this feast would have been accompanied by music and dancing and whirling, storytelling, chanting and chatter, but we routinely don't think about such things. It would have been heady and sensuous, with the smell of wood smoke, roast pork and beer, combined with flickering flames, garish costumes, and, well, who knows, but perhaps the consumption of hallucinogenic mushrooms. But archaeologists always miss the party. And this stillness we uncover feeds into how society generally learns about the past. Newspaper headlines, when a well-preserved archaeological site is discovered, describe it as frozen in time. Britain's Pompeii is another favourite. The implication is that something cataclysmic happened, rendering the site motionless. People stilled like statues with their arms raised up in horror. Archaeology is too often presented as a still photograph. The significance of movement is overlooked. The enormous Neolithic mound of Silbury Hill in Wiltshire is another wonderful monument I worked on. For over a year in 2007 and 2008, I led a team of archaeologists to excavate a tunnel into the centre of it to allow engineers to stabilise a collapse that could be seen on the summit. We also hoped to understand something of how it was made and perhaps glimpse at possible reasons why. And just incidentally, here's a photo of my wife in the audience also working. I tell you, archaeology is a family affair. One of the most striking things we discovered during our time in the tunnel was how, from the moment the mound was created until at least the medieval period, and probably much later, it was in constant motion, being added to and dug into, changed and altered. Quite a contrast with the way it was being managed, and it still is now, covered in short-cropped grass like some sort of suburban garden or golf course, all traces of humanity removed, as if preserved in aspect or covered by a bell jar, a precious artefact in need of protection from a dangerous world. Quite right too, you might say, but it does have the effect of imposing stillness that wasn't there before. It reminds me of the way oral stories are passed down generationally from parent to child, living things that alter as times change, but which, once they're written down, they become static and not to be messed with. And that can be deadening. For too long, there has been a tendency to focus on the fixed and more tangible elements of the past, on places rather than the movement to, from, and around them. On the one hand, this is completely understandable because with place there is something to see and excavate. We can be in a settlement and go to a monument. Archaeologists like neatly bounded sites that we can draw around, and if the sites are nationally important, we can secure them with legal protection as scheduled monuments. We like to impose boundaries, turning sites into containers of and for archaeology. This is perhaps because archaeology is an intangible subject to study. Mobility is an intangible subject to study, and archaeology deals poorly with the fleeting, the movement and displacement of people, things, and ideas. Mobility lacks a presence. But by studying only the site, we unthinkingly impose stillness on the past, which, to me, in a way, is a form of disenchantment that can rob it of all wonder. Even when the movement of people or objects is identified, it is often the place they came from or ended up that is highlighted. Rarely discussed are the movements in between. Place is always the starting point, not mobility. We prefer fixity rather than flow. It is the movements in between that are the important elements of life. Life unfolds, says the anthropologist and thinker Tim Ingold, instantly echoing the writer and journeyman Bruce Chapman, not in places, but along paths. We miss the action, the real life, if we don't look at people's movements. Of course, places are important, but we can afford to recognise that they are made up of the restless patterns of people moving between and through them, from one chamber to another, in and out of shops and houses, through tangles of alleys, plazas, streets and roads. Places are designed for access and movement, and as we see in our own time, they pulsate with life. Movement defies the notion of a neatly bounded site or monument. Of all sites, routeways are especially hard for heritage managers to protect, since they are long and linear and run across land owned by multiple people. They are also seen as the opposite of monuments because they are often created by being worn down as opposed to built up. They are negative features rather than positive. Yet they are every bit as monumental, more so in fact. They don't represent the actions of a few builders over a defined period, but the feat of many over vast lengths of time. Out of the 20,000 scheduled monuments in England, the only protected holloways, which are deeply incised paths, also known as sunken ways, that I can find are short sections that have been included almost incidentally as components of other monuments. Few are scheduled on their own due to their intrinsic importance. They are not automatically afforded the protection the more obvious archaeological sites receive. Recently I had a discussion with Neil Redfern, who's the director of the Council for British Archaeology, and he pointed out that there was actually one holloway that was scheduled, but then he also told me that it was only scheduled because they mistook it for a Roman road. And who knows how many holloways there actually are? No one has ever attempted an audit of them the way they have the other monuments like henges or hill forts. But surely that must be the starting point for protection. A recent project led by Natural England aims to change this, but perhaps it's telling that a similar project has not come from historic England, the emphasis being more the environmental importance rather than their historic value. In the village I live in on the North York Moors, the earthwork remains of a medieval Mott and Bailey castle is a scheduled monument. But the tangled and radiating holloways, earthworks every bit as impressive as the Mott and of the same date, or actually possibly even earlier, are not. So the landowners are free to scour them away, which they have done. Or, in the case of one I recently walked along, dug into and lined the bottom with hardcore. Well, at least it's preserved now, you might say, but like writing down an oral story or perhaps pinning a butterfly, it's no longer alive. And that seems a very great shame to me. And that's just one small personal example. Extend that out across the British Isles and then across Europe and beyond, and you start to see the extent of the problem. When mobility is discussed in archaeology, it is framed in highly rational terms, such as discussions surrounding optimal foraging strategies or nomadism and sedentism. It is framed as cost and benefit. Mobility strategies are chosen logically for their functional practicalities. It becomes an involuntary and behavioural reaction rather than a core component of the social world. This is what the anthropologist Tim Ingold, who I mentioned earlier, has termed in his characteristically eloquent way as a head-over-heels approach. That is, the belief that rational intelligence happens up here in the head, whilst the feet are simply a mechanical response to the brain. Too often, we describe the movements of people in the past as if they were all essentially robots marching rationally and impassively across the landscape. Having worked out a route people took, we make maps that resemble the opening credits of the television series Dad's Army, with long arrows pointing to where people came from and where they went to. For good reasons, we look for rational explanations, so that our discussions frame movement as logic. But the body is not a machine, and we don't walk in a uniform, regular way across a flat and even surface. Movement is complex, unpredictable, and often socially driven. In our own lives, we walk, shuffle, run, climb, dawdle and dance. We pace, march, swing, dash, stroll, crawl, scramble, ramble, plod, hobble, trudge and tramp. Linger, loiter, saunter, wander and roam. And each of these kinds of movement gives off a different message to the bystander. Other messages we might pass on through our walk include things like physical condition, age, or even just mood and emotional state. The vibrant energy of youth can be contrasted with the shuffling arthritic legs of old age, while a hobble may acknowledge a lifetime of hard work. A stooping trudge may be fatigue or depression or both. We walk differently depending on whether we are at the start or the end of our journey, an actual journey or life's metaphorical trip. There are sporty runners and slow plodders. There are the pregnant, the overweight, the ill and the injured. Mobility has different meanings depending on who you are and where you are and what sex you are. Coming across a stranger in an otherwise empty woodland engenders a different feeling to passing someone on a busy street. Someone walking uncomfortably close behind you on a street can feel threatening, depending on whether you and they are a man or woman, young or old. The social, political and cultural aspects of movement are frequently overlooked in archaeology. But as we've seen, mobility is full of significance and meaning, and we pass on a constellation of messages through it. It can be freedom and opportunity, just as it can be a form of control, or conversely, a way of resisting authority. A protest march, for example. And, of course, significantly reduced mobility can be a form of resistance too, used to great effect in recent years by the Occupy movement. Mobility can be used to exert power over people and groups, refugees perhaps. That is, some people have control over mobility and others don't. Moving in a crowd can be pleasurable and tactile, with all bodies moving together, such as the heaving, rhythmical masses seen at music festivals, whilst solitary movement can be a form of freedom and creativity, as the philosophers and writers we saw earlier showed. Some people and groups conform to socially acceptable levels of mobility and others do not. Unusually high mobility is often seen as a deviance, something threatening, to be feared, to be suspicious of, something to be controlled. This can be seen in, for example, the persecution of Gypsy, Romanian traveller groups across Europe in recent history. Different mobilities often reflect inequalities of power within society, being more available to, say, one gender than the other. Some people are also dependent on others in order to move. Children might have to travel with their parents, or a mobility impaired person may be dependent upon others to help them get around. Some have more mobility, others less. Further, people are affected by mobility, either intentionally or unintentionally, in different ways. For example, one group's mobility can reduce the mobility of another, while some mobilities are dependent on others. Some movements are unrestricted, others bounded. Some are hard, requiring exertion, and others easy. It is, in other words, unfair and unevenly distributed. Movement is also fundamentally an embodied experience. It works at the scale of the body and involves the entire body, including sight, hearing, touch and smell. It uses the hands and the lungs. It could, for the more physical journeys, also include pain. Mobility is also often entangled with feelings, desires and emotions, and indeed certain journeys may be undertaken in order to generate a particular feeling or emotion. A pilgrimage is a good example of this. Moving is a physical, sensuous experience. The body senses as it moves and mediates in and through the world. The head is not privileged over the heels. Moving, and in particular walking, is also an inherently social act. Just as culture can be expressed through, say, clothes or art, so too can it through the way a group moves. As the French sociologist Marcel Mauss pointed out in a very famous essay, all bodily techniques, including walking, vary according to cultural and local conventions. People also frequently learn and practice additional ones according to age, ethnicity, class, gender, sexual orientation, circumstance and choice. People move culturally and according to their environment, and it is framed differently by diverse groups in separate parts of the world and at a variety of times in the past. Me, as an Englishman, walks differently to somebody who was born and brought up in, say, Jamaica, and they walk differently to someone from Japan, and so on. We walk culturally. Individuals, too, can express themselves through the way they walk. As the famous philosophizing Gibb brothers, collectively known as the Bee Gees, put it, You can tell by the way I use my walk. I'm a woman's man, no time to talk. You can have that earworm on me. But in archaeology, we tend to forget about people strutting, like John Travolta. And I'm absolutely fascinated. I mean, it's a fantastic film, Saturday Night Fever, but I'm fascinated by the opening sequence for those of you that have seen it and can remember it. It's just John Travolta's feet. The camera is only on his feet. It's just about how he walks. And John Travolta describes it later on as a really carefully affected walk he learned from his school days in Brooklyn, from his black friends. But he describes it as the walk of coolness. And it is. He's got this strut to him. He's showing off to everyone. It's not a walk he does for himself. It's a walk to be seen. And through this walk, you know he's a dancer. You can see that. Anyway, go back and watch the film. But it really was not so different in the past. For Romans, walking was an ambulatory performance, and by their movement through the urban setting, they could advertise their status through motion. As the philosopher Seneca remarked, "We do not walk, we parade." The way one walked was of importance to the Romans and separated men from women and free men from slaves. Elite males were expected to exhibit self-control and decorum in their bodies. Indeed, their gait justified their social status as much as conveyed it. Young, freeborn men were trained to walk the right way, to acquire the skill. The speed at which one walked was also important. Slaves ran, but aristocratic men didn't, because they wanted to reflect a cautious and considered persona. They didn't linger either in case they appeared feminine. Seneca writes, "The sage does not need to walk timidly or one step at a time, for his confidence in himself is so great." As for Roman women, well, gait should be graceful but not ostentatious. Ovid set out the extremes to avoid in his poem The Art of Love. The dainty woman swings her sides artfully, taking in air with her flowing tunic as she haughtily takes measured steps. I'm not sure how that would look. Maybe. Whereas the uncultured woman plods like the sunburned wife of an Umbrian farmer and takes huge straddling steps. So to Ovid, the right way to walk for a woman was somewhere between those two. And it reminds me of, say, finishing schools and so on, where young women of a certain status were taught to walk in the right way. Certain architectural features in Roman villas provided settings for intellectual conversations, encouraging the movement of both body and mind. Gardens were private spaces that choreographed movements through colonnaded walkways and garden paths so that the householder could have ambling conversations with guests, the rhythm of walking shaping the rhythm of talking and vice versa. The same set of ideas of choreographed movements can be seen in medieval and Renaissance formal gardens. Here, designed landscapes represented carefully contrived settings in which people moved along a set of staged processional routes where views were manipulated and people admired the intended compositions and symmetry in front of them. The views of the castle or residence were carefully unveiled to the visitor stage by stage to create a spectacle. The form and layout of these gardens were deliberately designed to order and guide movement. Set apart from the humdrum activities of everyday life, gardens provided a different space to move around in. complex walkways provided for promenading conversations and amusing banter, for flirtation and whispered confidences amongst the shrubbery and away from the prying eyes and ears of the household. Tunnel arbours and pergolas provided shade as well as seclusion for visitors to sit in quiet contemplation or for coquettish dalliances. Indeed, pleasure gardens were often associated in medieval art and literature with courtly love. Gardens were invested with complex meaning and symbolism, and appreciation of them required knowledge of the proper way of moving around them. This form of movement is the embodiment of structured, ritualized movement. This is not so different to 18th century pleasure gardens, which were designed to choreograph movement. These here are the Vauxhall Gardens from 1750, whatever that is, I can't see it, 1751 maybe. They were used to advertise status through motion and loaded with meaning and power. In other words, like Roman movement, or John Travolta, walking was coded. It was a performance with an assumption that there was an audience to appreciate it. We see this in other countries too. In 19th century Paris, for example, bourgeois Parisians promenaded along the boulevards and squares of Baron Haussmann's spectacular new city. These renovations were principally intended to allow for greater flow of traffic as well as social control, but they also redefined urban space. Integral to Haussmann's work were new parks linked by boulevards from the city, and these were hugely popular. Both tourists and Parisians alike flocked to these new spaces to strike poses and show off their clothes and their sophisticated gait. Young dandies displayed their fine stockinged calves. Impressionist painters such as Monet, Degas and Renoir went on to document this social spectacle. And as new lighting technologies emerged, promenading at night became popular too. The notion of promenading was central to the rise of the society of spectacle, and verbs such as to stroll and to saunter, which had previously been associated with vagabonds, could now take on an air of respectability. Much like the formal gardens, some prehistoric monuments structured movement. Causewayed enclosures, henges, and timber and stone circles contain within them some form of structured movement. Here we have the Neolithic stone and timber circle of Woodhenge in Wiltshire. By analysing the formal deposition of artefacts within the monument, archaeologist Josh Pollard suggested that a sense of the movement through and around the stone and timber settings can be determined. Clearly, there were rules to moving around this monument. The stone and timber settings regulated and controlled movement. In a sense, this and all these other similar monuments were coded spaces, much like royal palaces or the gardens we've just seen. And of course, structured movement like this also means that some people were restricted and perhaps excluded. In other words, it created a hierarchy. Clearly, movement around at least some prehistoric monuments was structured and choreographed. The architecture ordered movement and directed people, but it also controlled and restricted access and movement. Now, I'm just going to show you a photo of some human skeletal remains. For anyone that doesn't want to see them, do look away. Many of these themes, performative, meaningful, and gendered mobility, are exemplified by the act of going on a pilgrimage. And indeed, many of our prehistoric monuments may have originally been created as pilgrimage centres. I've removed the photo of the human remains. The figure of a pilgrim is certainly an archetypal image of someone on the move, and pilgrimage was a significant reason for journeying in the past. And instantly here we have one of Michel's amazing lino cuts artwork, which are in the book. A pilgrimage is characterised by movements, sometimes formalised to and from sacred places that serve a wider community. It is not an everyday movement like hunting, gathering or commuting, but a special occasion, generally planned well in advance. And it tends to be movement between states of being, both physical and spiritual. In that sense, every part of the trip has heightened significance. For this reason, the appeal of a pilgrimage is in the journey as much as the start and the end points. Dance is another good example of meaningful mobility. It is a means of expression, improvisation and creativity, and yet it is frequently socially encoded and can be highly political. Both social and power relations can be played out through dance, and it is often codified with place, revealing an individual's belonging. In this way, bodily movement can enact place and place in society, reproducing and emphasising and refracting ideals of gender, issues of race and cultural differences and so on. Bodily movement is loaded with meaning, and indeed dance, a bit like storytelling, may well have been a major driver in cultural mobility, particularly in prehistory, as a point that is rarely considered. Another one of Michel's wonderful pieces of art. If a route is used by the same group often enough for specific purposes, it can take on associations with them. Pilgrimage routes, as well as paths and roads to churches, religious shrines and other places of importance, sometimes took on the association with their destination and became themselves sacred, ceremonial or ritual. Corpse roads are a good example of this. These were used in the medieval and later periods to transport the dead, along with the funeral party, to the nearest licensed burial ground, which in remote areas could be some miles over the countryside. One last journey before the individual's final resting place. And as a result of this association with the dead, these roads tended to accumulate special significance in folk tales, with stories of ghosts and processions of spirits moving along them. Shakespeare talks about this in one of his sonnets. Crossroads seems to have been interesting places in the past too. Markers, stone crosses and statues of saints were often placed at crossroads in the medieval period as landmarks for travellers. The place where traffic converges is clearly a good spot to advertise certain messages and reach wide audiences. Execution sites were also often located at crossroads. We can see this with the famous Tyburn gallows in London, which existed from at least the 12th century through to the early 18th century at the junction of two Roman roads, now Edgware Road and Oxford Street. Criminals, deviants and social outcasts were sometimes buried at crossroads, and it's not surprising that crossroads attracted stories of witches, ghosts and magic. Suicide victims were also sometimes buried at crossroads, generally after the body had been dragged through the streets and mocked and sometimes even staked through the heart. Remarkably, this burial practice continued up until the Burial of Suicide Act of 1823, when it was abolished. Burying people at crossroads acknowledged that these were liminal spaces where journeys changed direction and decisions must be made. The spirits of the people buried there would, it was hoped, be puzzled into indecision and therefore immobility. Paths and routeways are themselves social spaces that channel diverse groups of people where they could mingle and meet as they moved. In both the imagination and in real life, being on a path, a trackway or road provides a different space, a space in which other things can happen. It provides time outside life, in which social norms can be bent and twisted, daily rhythms and routines changed. These changes provide opportunities for different ways of existing, for exploring inadequacies in normal routines. Travelling on the road allows one to view the world in a different way, to reimagine it. Familiar networks such as family, community, faith or tradition are loosened on the road, while at the same time bonds between travellers can be strengthened, joined by their shared experiences of travelling together. Think of the film Thelma and Louise, where they're challenging a patriarchal society as they go on this magnificent road trip, which ends, we assume, tragically. Routeways are hubs of activity. They are mobile gathering places, and we inhabit them in motion. They are designed for movement, places of physical mobility, nodes of desire and connectors of different places and distant lands. They are more than simply functional marks on the landscape. Routeways and mobility more broadly shape how the traveller thinks, perceives and interacts with the world around them, and helps form their lives. They create certain views which structure how a person or community understands their surroundings. Despite their obvious association with movement, when viewed as history or archaeology, paths, tracks and roads tend to be seen as passive, static artefacts. They are anything but passive, though. They act on people as much as people act on them. They have agency, structure our lives, and are a critical part of our lived space. A path or road is not just a means of getting from A to B, it is a place in its own right. Furthermore, they have never sat separately from their landscape, but are woven into the fabric of it. They are part of it. Worth thinking about whilst the battle over the road around Stonehenge continues. The road itself is a part of that landscape, it has its own history. This talk, of course, is in no way comprehensive. You can go and buy the book if you want that. But hopefully it has shown how ideas about and practices of mobility have always been variable and inconsistent. Mobility is not simply movement, but embodied movement, potential movement, free movement, restricted movement. And it is made up of economic, social and political relations. Movement is an essential part of our lived experience. Throughout time, entire groups, cultures and societies have been constructed out of their distinctive movements. And it has always underpinned and informed the way we see the world. Discussions of mobility in the archaeological literature remain frustratingly rational and abstracted from the actual experience of movement, especially, I think, when discussing prehistory. Moving is so natural, so everyday that it's easy to overlook, but we miss the real action when we do that. For this reason, we need to refocus our view of the past away from frozen places and stock-still sites to movement and mobility. By following footsteps, we find the texture of paths and the places they connect. We hear settlements alive and full of busy people, the hubbub of business, the shouts of street vendors, the din from the inns. We see gossip spreading along lanes and alleys. These were the conduits where real life happened. Rhythms of all kind pulsed through places and paths. By shifting our focus to the way people moved, we infused the past once again with the dynamism and vital force it once contained, letting it live in the present. We can begin to reanimate it, to imagine monuments and the areas between them seethe and heave with life, and hear the buzz of busy streets in towns and villages. This is what could be called a mobile archaeology or an archaeology of movement, and stands in contrast to a static view of the past which frames mobility as an economic function of being human. And on that note, I hope that you feel inspired enough to at least pick up and flick through a copy of Footmarks, which are downstairs. It's due out probably on the 6th of July. You're a lucky bunch because there are 30 copies downstairs. It's a wonderful book. I'm really, really proud of it. It's taken, well, the last decade to write. It's full of personal elements, but also all this stuff that I've just talked to you about. And it's got these incredible lino cuts from the artist Michelle Hughes and a whole raft of rather lovely comments from all sorts of notables and worthies. Thank you.
So I'm going to, thank you very much, Jim. I'm going to invite Michelle and Jim to come and sit down here. I don't know about the rest of you, but gosh, I've got a lot to think about after that talk. And one thing I'm thinking about is, how do I walk? Am I like a Roman woman or a Umbrian peasant? I certainly don't walk like John Travolta anyway. I'm sure we're all going to be a bit self-conscious as we walk out. I just wondered whether actually, before we just open up to a few questions, whether Michelle and Jim could tell us a little bit about the process of the book and the art that goes in that book, because having seen it myself, it really does help you feel like you're on a journey as you're reading the book, and the beautiful illustrations of the pilgrim and the footprints and the animal prints and so on. They just add a wonderful element to the book. So, do you want to tell us a little bit about how you got together and how you were inspired, I suppose, by some of the themes in the book?
Well, I mean, it started off with me contacting Michelle. The university, I should say, funded most of the illustrations, the large illustrations. I got in touch with Michelle, who was delighted to be involved, and Michelle read an early draft of the book, an embarrassingly early draft.
Very, very good, though.
and then just really engaged with her. So.
Yeah, I mean, I do a lot of walking and cycling in the landscape, particularly of Yorkshire. So a lot of it was sort of about us speaking to each other and then bringing that to life. So I've used a lot of my photographs that I take as reference, and then I do initial sketches, and then I've carved that into lino. It's like floor lino. And then the lines that are carved away become the white of the paper, and then the black is what's printed. So I ink up the block, put paper on top, and then take an impression from that. But it is a very, very, very good book. Go and buy it.
Great. Well, thank you very much. So, can we open up to any questions for either Jim or Michelle? Has anyone got anything? Okay, we have got microphones, and if you don't mind using the microphones for the recording and the hearing loop, that would be great. Thank you.
Hi there, thanks for a great talk. I was just curious if you'd done, part of your research, you'd shown fantastic grand walks there in Vauxhall, 18th century ones, but we had one built here in York down by the Ouse at the same time. I just wonder if you'd got any more details about that and its consequences.
I don't. I'm a prehistorian, really.
Right.
And so normally I deal with anything from the Mesolithic, which is also Nikki's specialism, into the Neolithic, and that's where I come from, and that's what I normally excavate. And what this book has been for me has been a sort of process of discovery, and trying to trace paths back and walking techniques back through the past, and trying to get into prehistory in a sense. So I know really little about it. I just found the whole kind of moving around parks and things absolutely fascinating. But in terms of the local area, I don't. Sorry.
Do you think that the COVID paths which emerged during the first lockdown, where they were just maybe a little bit of a track and now they're about 6 feet wide and all the grass has disappeared, do you think that will actually bewilder archaeologists in the future, or whether they will be able to trace the way that we have changed our movements?
I mean, it's a really, really good question. Paths are fascinating in terms of their history, largely because a path exists because people walk it, and you stop walking it, and they stop existing. So a lot of these COVID paths are temporary, but if they carry on being walked, then they will actually turn into something else. So when you walk down a path now, any footpath, bridleway, actually you have a really distinctive environment along it. It's a linear environment, and it's made up of often blackberries, crab apples, hazel tree, hazelnuts. That's no coincidence that any of those exist along paths. Paths have this incredible environmental history that can be untangled. We are almost entirely blind to it now. I know of no one other than some thoughts from Martin Bell that is attempting to trace paths through their environmental history, but we can do. So when you walk down a path, and you're eating on a crab apple, and then you spit the pips to one side, or you throw the core over, a tree grows, and over time you create these. The same happens with blackberries. Same happens with hazelnuts. When you sort of plunge your hand into your pocket to a pocket full of hazelnuts, some you'll scatter, and some will grow into trees. There's quite good evidence, actually, that paths were deliberately maintained, so people were deliberately planting certain types of food plants along them in order to give the traveller, something to eat on the way. And so that history can go back hundreds, actually thousands of years. And it's worth bearing in mind, the other thing that frustrates me is the way that paths are ripped out by councils and landowners, or they're widened, just because the line is open. Actually, we need to protect that linear arrangement of food plants. And so, I suppose what I'm saying is that actually, over time, distinctive paths develop. Time will tell whether these new paths will actually turn into paths from the long-term paths with their own distinctive environment. We'll find out. But I think I think COVID times is going to be a really interesting horizon in the archaeological record. When I was out walking the other day, and it was along a bridleway, and it was quite muddy. It was before all of this incredibly dry weather, and a horse had squished up just something orange that I could see, and I sort of just kicked it with my foot. It was a face mask. So there will be a COVID horizon out there, and that will exist along paths. But.
So maybe one more question before we finish.
I was just interested in the idea of, Russ Chapman's, actually the songlines, there being whole paths of religious meaning in a sense.
Yeah. So Bruce Chatwin, who was an archaeology student up in Edinburgh, he was a fantastic writer. Died of AIDS, sadly, in the 80s, I think. But he did some wonderful stuff, and one of the things, his most famous work really was on the song lines, and in Australia, the Aboriginal song lines, which are these are trails that are kind of sung into being, and you can by knowing the songs, you can actually traverse huge parts of Australia, following the direction of the songs, and you get the same sort of thing in various parts of the US, for example, in First Nation groups and so on. So they're really wonderful things, and of course, I always have that in my mind when I'm thinking about prehistory. I'm sure Nikki does the same, and in the Neolithic, for example, we have a type of very linear monument known as a cursus monument. No one can fully explain what they are, but they do look like sort of ritualised paths that sometimes go on for kilometres. And it's often struck me, are they sort of some kind of Neolithic songline. Anyway, I suggest that in the book. So, thank you.
Well, I think we probably better wrap up now, but I know that Jim and Michelle are going to be downstairs, and you might have heard the book is downstairs, and the prints are downstairs as well. And I would encourage you just to go and have a look at it. I have I only got it a day ago, but I started reading it. I really couldn't put it down. I had to put it down in the end. I haven't finished it, but it is a beautifully written book, and beautiful illustrations through it. And I think we've all probably learnt a lot today, and I hope that when you go on your next walk, you'll be thinking of all the people who may have walked there before you. And even, as archaeologists, we look at a landscape, we don't always know exactly what happened there, but when you start looking at it in a different way, it gives a whole new dimension to the walks that you go on. So can I ask you all to thank very much again Jim for bringing us here.